I think when you look at what's actually happened to planning over recent years, it has gone through a huge amount of reform. And I think if you look at where the government are now, they're sort of both realising the limitations of planning per se as the tool that gets us out of this, and are also increasingly committed to trying to find a way to build the number of homes we need. And I think what we're hopefully seeing now is a realisation that it's not just about, giving out as many planning permissions as possible, because that's not disrupting the root of the problem. The root of the problem is that we have a building system which is based on the sale of incredibly expensive land, which is then developed by a very small number of speculative developers, building quite a narrow model focused around home ownership. And when you've got that structure, it's not surprising that we end up with our current situation, which is kind of low delivery of predominantly not affordable housing. And I think what you are beginning to see in government is this growing realisation that it's that approach that has to change. And from Shelter's perspective, the real prize has to be, how do you get land into the hands of people who are serious about developing a broad range of tenures, particularly affordable housing, and crucially, they can buy that land at a price that enables them to develop that kind of housing. And I think that's where actually you probably do need a real role for government. And crucially, you are going to have to look at some quite politically difficult things like compulsory purchase orders. How do we make it easier for local authorities and other bodies who are serious about building to get land at a price that enables development of affordable homes? And I think actually when you look at what the government is beginning to do, there are some really promising signs that they realise actually that this kind of model of land trading, which has only really developed in the last few decades, is just not compatible with trying to deliver at scale. So you are beginning to see the political will to look at the way land is valued, to look at the way land is traded, and actually make sure that land is being bought by people who are serious about developing at a price that enables them to do so. So I think there are grounds for optimism there from government, but obviously, people hear the words compulsory purchase order and reform of land values, and it sounds very scary. So I think what's going to be important is that we develop some consensus around this. So you need to make it as safe as possible for government to feel that they have the authority and the will behind them to do these reforms, because it is only this type of action that's actually going to enable them to deliver the number of homes that they acknowledge we need to deliver. It's funny, isn't it? Because certainly at Shelter we talk about the way everyone is increasingly affected by the housing crisis. And actually we all know that it's not really true. A lot of people have done very well out of the housing crisis. It is a very odd situation that we all got up this morning and go to work, and our income from today will be taxed, but any growth in our house prices will be entirely for us to enjoy. And I think we are in quite a weird situation in the UK where we are very, very reluctant to look at that huge imbalance in taxation and the fact that we have created some very, very difficult incentives for ordinary people to invest all of their wealth and potential wealth in property. So realistically, it is a huge task to try and get people to change the way they've seen their housing wealth, and it's not a politically easy object. I think if we saw the reaction to the proposals around using housing equity to fund social care and the way that went down, people are very, very reluctant to lose what they perceive as their right to the housing equity. I think what's interesting though is actually if you look at what's happened in very recent times around second home ownership, so particularly ownership by landlords, there have been some quite rapid changes. There have been some really serious moves in government, begun under George Osborne, to really change the taxation around landlords and make it much less advantageous to be a landlord. And I think what everyone will be looking at now is what's the effect of that? Does it change the balance of landlords buying versus first-time buyers? Does it actually impact on supply in the private rented sector? Because as much as politically there will always be a debate about the aspiration to buy, actually when you look at people's incomes, we do need, in the absence of social housing, a viable private rented sector. So I'm sure the Treasury will be looking very closely at what impact those tax reforms have on supply. But I think they were the beginning of a more honest conversation about how we tax property and how you use different taxes to incentivise different groups of people. I think we're in a really interesting place with social housing, where certainly a few years ago it seemed to be absolutely politically nowhere. And in fact, all of the momentum within government was actually about diminishing social housing. You know, we had the extension of right to buy to housing associations, funding for new supply was cut back, you had changes to welfare and rents, which made it much harder for housing associations to develop. You had councils being forced to sell off council homes. So a few years ago, it really did look like it was time to kind of say this is the death of social housing. Things are now changing quite quickly, and you suddenly had the Prime Minister last year using the words social housing, and you have the Ministry forming new teams which are about social housing. And I think these are some really encouraging green shoots, that complete denial of the role that social housing could play is over. But we are still a very, very long way from where we need to be in terms of the political will and, crucially, the funding to get the scale of social housing that you need. I think one big argument to make in favour of social housing is that you are not going to get the headline figures that the government is aspiring to, of sort of 300,000 homes a year, if you are only doing it through home ownership. You need a diversity of tenures to hit that level of supply, because bluntly there just aren't enough people who can afford home ownership anymore, and it is not in developers' interest to be producing en masse a product that they can't sell. So we are not going to get the level of supply that we need unless we are providing social housing. I think as well, as people begin to realise that the fall in home ownership wasn't just a blip around the credit crunch, there is scope for a more honest conversation about what is the long-term offer for people on low but also average incomes who are currently really poorly served by the private rented sector. You know, they have the highest housing costs on average and very little security of tenure. And the government is definitely alive to that as a problem. But so far it's translated into conversations about how can you reignite home ownership, how can you encourage private landlords to provide greater security of tenure. What we need to do actually is shift the debate so that social housing once again seems like the solution for people who are frustrated in the private rented sector. I think the challenge we undoubtedly have is, since the late 70s and certainly since the 80s, social housing has been incredibly marginalised. It's been residualised as a sector. So often, if you're a sort of a young, not particularly well-paid household in the private rented sector, you just don't think of social housing as an option for you. You know, it's equated with benefits, it's equated with a safety net. And actually, it's that approach and that residualisation that really needs to shift. And that's a very challenging shift to pull off. But I think unless the government and the public can see social housing as a solution to the housing crisis as it currently manifests itself, then you are going to struggle to get the political will for the numbers needed. One of the big challenges that we've had in recent years is you've had much less government grant going into building social housing. So you've had much more reliance on developers to provide it as part of their Section 106 contributions. But because of the viability loophole that exists, it's been incredibly easy for them to argue that it's simply not viable to develop social housing. And it's been incredibly difficult for local authorities who are fully aware of how much social housing they need to push back and insist that what's built in their area reflects local needs. And again, this is one of those areas where you are beginning to see some really positive signs from government. There was a clear intention in the draft National Planning Policy Framework to make it much, much harder for developers to essentially wriggle out of their obligation to provide social housing by gaming the viability assessments. I think when you look at the detail, it's not quite there yet, But you are seeing this kind of growing acceptance from ministers that it's not a question of the developers holding the country to ransom effectively, and they do want to use the MPPF to try and get more social housing. And again, that's just something that you wouldn't have expected a few years ago, and it's really welcome to be in that position where the will is there, even if the detail isn't quite following through yet.